In case you've been living under a rock for the last few years, the European Union has some very strict rules on fuel economy and emissions. If a car company makes cars that pump out too much CO2, they get a massive fine. Keep that in mind. Okay, now last year, Honda, just over half of their sales in the UK came from their very efficient, fuel-sipping Jazz Hybrid Super Mini. These cars really don't use a lot of fuel, so they don't pump out too much carbon dioxide, so they must be absolutely fine with no danger of getting any CO2 fines, right? Wrong. Amazingly, Honda had one of the worst figures for average CO2 emissions. In fact, Honda's so bad in this area, they had to be rescued by Tesla. Yeah, Elon, yeah, it's Honda. Can you talk? Can you help us out? You need money to buy Twitter. Funny that, because how? Well, by pooling or combining its average emissions with Tesla to bring its average down in the UK this year to avoid paying fines. Honda also went, cap in hand, to Tesla for the European Union last year to form a pool along with Jaguar Land Rover to have Tesla's emissions dilute their own. The logic is pretty simple. If your car's emission levels are up here and Tesla's are down here at ground zero, then if you join forces, then suddenly your average drops and you don't get fined. Now, JLR, you can imagine having a problem with CO2 emissions. They make big, heavy cars and don't sell too many electric cars to reduce the average CO2 output. They might need help from Tesla. But Honda, do they really need help? Well, yeah. You see, the Tesla rescue was actually crucial because if Elon didn't bail out Honda, then Honda would have been left paying absolutely enormous fines. Check this out. Both the European Union and the UK copied and pasted EU regulation 2019/613 when we Brexited in 2020. That regulation requires car makers to cut average CO2 emissions for all cars sold from 2020 to 95 grams per kilometer or below. Now, there's a little bit of leeway if you sell heavier cars, and there's also something called super credits that count electric car sales as being worth 1.33 sales this year, although not next year. If you go over that 95 grams per kilometer limit, then you have to pay 95 euros for every gram you break, multiplied by the number of cars you sell. That's a lot of money. As you can imagine, that gets pretty expensive pretty quickly if you sell big amounts. So how bad was Honda's CO2 figure? Well, we don't know its UK average, but the market researchers, JATO Dynamics, calculated that Honda's average across Europe, including the UK, was 114.6 grams per kilometer of CO2 for 2021. Now that's pretty bad considering across the entire industry, the average CO2 was 99 grams per kilometer, again, according to JATO. Now that puts Honda 22nd in the league table of manufacturers, just behind Jaguar. In fact, Honda only cut its emissions by 9% last year compared to a 19% average improvement by the car industry overall, again according to JATO. 29 brands made bigger improvements than Honda, including Ferrari, they improved 18%, Bentley 15%, Rolls-Royce an amazing 11% improvement. Now, we don't know what Honda's targets were, but given it sells fairly light cars, we'd imagine it was pretty close to that 95 grams per kilometer. Yes, it did sell some Honda E electric cars, but not that many, only around 3,500 across Europe, partly due to the fact that it's quite expensive. Shame, because it is quite lovable. So it didn't score too much in the way of super credits. Now, one useful thing for Honda, I guess, is the fact that its sales figures are not quite what they used to be across Europe or the UK, which is its biggest market in Europe. In total, the brand sold 68,346 cars in the European Union and UK last year, which means it was outsold by Porsche and Mitsubishi, the latter of which has actually pulled out of a few markets, including the UK. Now, that reduces its potential fine, but despite that, given the gap between its CO2 target and its actual figure, according to JATO, we'd estimate that they could have been in line for a fine as much as 100 million euros in the European Union and UK. You know, if they didn't pay a big chunk of cash to Tesla for pulling them out of a hole. So how on earth does a company like Honda get into that situation when most of the cars they sell are hybrid Jazzes? Well, it's because the regulations are tough. 95 grams per kilometer is the equivalent of 69 miles per gallon. So even though the Jazz is a small, lightweight hybrid, its lowest CO2 figure is 102 grams per kilometer, or 63 miles per gallon. So there's not a hope in hell you're going to beat those figures by focusing on small hybrid super minis. You need something you plug in. Now, a lot of people see this as a big failing of the system. In this system, the Jazz is made out to look like the villain, and a great big hulking plug-in hybrid SUV is made out to be a hero. And that's because they achieve much lower official figures in the official economy tests. For example, the Range Rover Sport plug-in hybrid is rated as low as 64 grams per kilometer for CO2. Can a big old Range Rover really be better for the environment than a little Jazz? Now, we've talked here before in the past about the dubiousness of whether plug-in hybrids get anywhere near their official figures in the real world, but the fact remains that the authorities in both the UK and the European Union count them as being a lot greener, and therefore they become almost as useful as a straight electric car as a way to cut your CO2 emissions. Just ask Ford. Pretty much their entire strategy to meet emissions targets in the UK and European Union is based around sales of the Cougar plug-in hybrid SUV. That's the car that's bringing their average emissions down to an acceptable level. Now let's look at Honda's lineup. Tumbleweed. No plug-in hybrids anywhere. I mean, they have the Honda E electric car, whose base price is actually higher than the CR-V hybrid SUV. So people aren't really tripping over themselves to buy it. So the car's ability to drag down Honda's average is pretty limited. I think it's all a bit ridiculous, really. In fact, a lot ridiculous, given that hybrids have a proven ability to cut fuel consumption in the local stop-start driving situations that Honda Jazz owners usually subject them to. But rules are rules, and Honda has to address them, belatedly, and in a really weird way. Honda have said that they'll bring in a new version of the CR-V mid-sized SUV that will include a plug-in hybrid for the first time in 2023. Now, amazingly, this segment was the greenest in 2021, according to JATO, because it had average emissions of 65.4 grams per kilometer, thanks to the fact that out of the 39 different mid-sized SUV models available last year, 28 featured a battery electric or plug-in hybrid electric powertrain. There's also more electrification coming from Honda later on in autumn. It's getting rid of all the petrol engine Civics for a new hybrid only option. And next year it's bringing out a new electric small SUV based on the ENY1 prototype, which looks a bit like an electric version of the HR-V small SUV. But that's not for another year, hence Honda's need to hitch itself to Tesla's electric wagon for 2022. We can argue that the rules are wrong, but really Honda did have plenty of warning about them, so paying Tesla was avoidable. I guess it's a good job that Tesla was actually around to rescue another well-loved but heel-dragging brand, just like it did with FCA and specifically Alfa Romeo back in 2020. Alfa, by the way, still hasn't addressed their emissions issue, but by becoming part of the giant Stellantis 14 brand behemoth, it does at least hide some of its shortcomings. Tesla, meanwhile, looks like it saved, or at least saved a bunch of cash, for yet another petrol brand that suddenly found itself playing catch up in the fast-moving sprint to zero emissions. Thanks, Elon.